Look, the courts move slowly at the best of times, and these are not the best of times, Steph. It's surprising that we have not seen a decision from the Court of Appeals in the District of Columbia yet. I think we all anticipated that. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem. These are just judges, 3 judges who have to reach a decision together. And sometimes that takes time. In my career as an appellate lawyer, it often took more than a year. Here we're talking about a matter of weeks. As far as Eileen Cannon goes, though, the handwriting has been on the wall for a long time that she'll do everything she can to prevent trying this case before the election takes place. She's drawn out this process involved with classified discovery and her decision-making process to the point where the Section 4 hearing won't even take place until the middle of next month. So I think we can count out the possibility that this case gets tried anytime soon.
John, we've seen it over the last few weeks. Donald Trump rallying against judges, prosecutors, Biden, any and all Democrats right outside during his civil cases on the courthouse steps. If these criminal cases don't start this summer or even the fall, what is the race for the White House going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to a lot of it's going to be a question of whether voters want to see Donald Trump continue to be prosecuted. If there is not a conclusion heading into that election, that's going to be a big part of the argument. And what we've seen from Donald Trump, certainly these allegations against him, the court cases he's facing, have helped him in the Republican primary. I think, it's a wild card as to what would happen if he were actually convicted of a crime. But, with that up in the air, I think it's hard to tell right now what the effect of all of it's going to be. One thing I can tell you that's going on right now is that his politics and his legal cases have merged. We just saw tonight his super PAC filed its campaign finance filing for the last 6 months of last year, and they transferred $30 million to the main vehicle that he's using to pay legal fees. So that's $30 million that's not going to be used on the campaign trail.
I want to stay on those campaign dollars, Joyce, because today Donald Trump was asked if he would use campaign money to pay E. Jean Carroll for the defamation penalties, which are over $80 million, and he did not say no. Watch this.
That case is a ridiculous case. We're appealing it. She didn't know anything about me. She didn't know when it happened. There was nothing. People are looking at that case. It's a disgrace. We're appealing that case. We had a very hostile judge. We're appealing that case. It's a ridiculous case.
So he didn't say no. We know that he used $50 million from super PAC money to pay legal bills. Could he use donor dollars to pay her?
Well, certainly he can try, right? But the reality for Donald Trump is that the next thing he has to do is post an appellate bond in this case if he wants to appeal the decision. And will he be able to scrape together donor money and have that pass legal scrutiny with, he's now got some decent lawyers on his team. They're very likely to look at that and tell him, no, sir, you can't do it this way. These aren't the kind of dollars that you can use to satisfy a judgment against you in court. So Donald Trump, increasingly, we have now reached the point where he meets the long arm of the law and finds out that he can't always do things and manipulate money in the way he's been used to doing for so many years.
Michael, new topic. President Biden and Donald Trump are in a battle for union endorsements. Help us understand how critical the union vote is. And it's two-pronged, because even if Joe Biden is getting union leadership, like the auto workers, he's got to get rank and file, which is sort of Donald Trump's sweet spot.
Yes, Steph, this is really one of the most fascinating things for you and me to cover throughout this election year, right? Because we've talked a lot about the Biden campaign's focus on the issue of democracy and the threat that they believe the former president poses to the future of this country. We've talked about the focus on abortion rights. That was the big rally that the president, the vice president, the first lady, the second gentleman held just a few weeks ago. But inside the West Wing, President Biden and his senior team are obsessed with winning the economic argument in 2024. This is a president who a year ago was talking about the legacy of his party that he was trying to break away from as limousine liberals. He wants this to be the party of the working class, the ordinary Joe. And so he's approaching his State of the Union address the next few weeks, laser focused on the economy. And he has the endorsement of some of the nation's largest unions. He's going to Michigan tomorrow to highlight the most recent endorsement from the United Auto Workers. But there is a concern that the rank and file of these unions are, as the former president said today during his visit to the Teamster Union, leaning towards Donald Trump. And so the president, he's been criticized by some in his party for focusing too much on the economy, too much on Bidenomics. But he is going to be spending a lot of time trying to do exactly what he's doing tomorrow, showing him side by side, saying he's not just physically with them, but he's on the policy, been with them every step of the way in his presidency.
John, but here's why Joe Biden can and should talk about the economy. He's got a winning one. There are 10 different measures that show it. And Donald Trump is out there straight up lying, crediting himself with the strong stock market, lying, saying oil production is down. People are able to see how much money is in their wallet. They can look at their 401k. They know how much things cost. And yes, life is still expensive, but inflation is cooling, and we may get a Fed rate cut soon. Are people buying what Donald Trump is trying to claim?
Well, I think a lot of people have been buying it, that the economy isn't doing well. You know, if you go back to 1992, Bill Clinton ran against a recovering economy, and his message, "It's the economy, stupid," was repeated so often that people believed that the economy was worse than it actually was. So there's some precedent for doing that and having some success with it. That said, look, I think anytime President Biden can connect what he's doing with the economy writ large to what's going on in people's lives on a daily basis, that makes a lot more sense to them. It's easier to sell than to talk about, what we have to talk about at the national level, unemployment rate, some of the things that factor into what people are feeling at home. But he's got to be able to connect what he's doing legislatively, what he's doing with executive action to people's lives. And, I think it was really remarkable. You showed before the clip of the Teamsters president coming out and talking about, which president was going to be for working people. The fact that the president of the Teamsters is, basically flirting with Donald Trump is really sort of amazing. 3 years ago, Joe Biden got through a $90 billion bailout of the pension funds of unions, primarily the Teamsters Central State Fund. It was the thing they were trying to do for 20 or 30 years. Biden delivers it for him. And here 3 years later, the president of that union obviously feels enough pressure from his membership that he wants to meet with Donald Trump. I mean, I think it's unfathomable that they would actually endorse Trump, but just the fact that he feels the need to be seen with him and take a meeting gives you an indication of how nervous some of Joe Biden's traditional allies feel right now.
Well, it's a meeting, but not an endorsement. Mike, it is tricky, though, for the Biden administration because they want to celebrate some of these wins, but they don't want to anger certain factions of their party, the far left, for example. Oil production is the best example. I said it before. We are producing more oil than any country ever. And that is a difficult conversation for the president because he doesn't want to upset voters who consider climate their top issue. But do those voters realize that Donald Trump cares nothing about their agenda? Well, it might not be Joe Biden's number one. It's Donald Trump's number 468. And in fact, he wants to go in the opposite direction.
Yeah, in fact, we heard Donald Trump today talking about wanting to get rid of some of the Biden administration's policies, moving to things like electric vehicle production. And so this is when you talk to Biden advisors about the fact that the president's poll numbers continue to be in a dangerous place for an incumbent heading into the election year. They say if you look under the hood at these numbers, some of our weakness is the fact that our base is not quite as rallied behind President Biden in the way that the MAGA base is lockstep with the former president at this point. And you talk about the issue of climate. The president is in particular dire straits with young voters, and that is one of the top issues for young voters is this climate crisis. Well, I was with the president in South Carolina over the weekend where he got an enthusiastic reception from the South Carolina Democratic Party dinner, but there were protests among them on this issue of climate. The campaign feels that one of the things that will help him is that this will ultimately have to be, as the president likes to say, a choice not between himself and the almighty, but himself and the alternative. And they will spend some time, maybe not the president himself, but some of their powerful surrogates, making the argument that there is no daylight between the president and his base on these core issues. He has done a lot, and he will continue to do more than what we would see if Donald Trump returns to the White House.
Yeah, look at what was inside the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it was some of the most aggressive moves in terms of climate. John, Donald Trump's base might be loud, but they're not large.
Yeah. Stephanie, you've always been impressed me with your ability to count. And as we looked at that last 2020 election, Joe Biden won by, what was it, 7.5 million votes, something like that. Look, the Donald Trump base is, what we've seen is maybe about 35 to 40% of the Republican Party. The number of people, the percentage of the Republican Party willing to vote for him is obviously a lot larger. But look, in poll after poll, you see that Donald Trump's favorable ratings are underwater. What you have is a country that's looking at, a choice that it made 3 or 4 years ago and will be asked to make again. But Donald Trump can't win with just his base. He should have learned that before 2020. He did learn it in 2020, or at least it was taught to him, whether or not it was absorbed. And we will have to see if he changes his stripes at all and figures out a way to try to compete with persuadable voters this time.